For most of the Soviet era, detectives had no DNA databases, no rapid genetic matches, and no modern lab shortcuts. Yet they still had to solve murders, disappearances, and serial cases with whatever they could gather from a scene, a witness, or a pattern. That is why this story matters. It shows what crime-solving looked like when the margin for error was much wider, and the darkness around a case was often deeper. Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker realities behind the image of Soviet order. To understand how Soviet detectives worked before modern DNA, it helps to start with a simple distinction. DNA analysis identifies a person by examining DNA directly. Earlier forensic methods worked indirectly, through what the U.S. National Library of Medicine calls gene products, such as blood groups and enzymes. Those older methods could sometimes exclude a suspect very effectively, but they could not individualize a person with the precision of modern DNA profiling. That meant Soviet investigators had to build cases from layers of probability rather than one decisive laboratory result. So what did they rely on instead? They relied on the fundamentals of pre-DNA policing: witness statements, fingerprints, trace evidence, biological material, clothing fibers, hairs, shoe prints, and patient reconstruction of a victim's last known movements. The National Institute of Justice notes that evidence at a crime scene can be testimonial, meaning statements from witnesses or victims, and physical, meaning tangible items such as latent fingerprints, hair, fibers, impression evidence, and biological material. Britannica's overview of crime scene investigation adds the older principle behind all this. Every contact leaves a trace, and even when no one sees the crime happen, the scene itself may still speak. That is the first important point. Soviet detectives were not working in pure instinct. They were working with real forensic logic, just without the genetic certainty that later investigators would come to expect. Blood typing, for example, could be helpful. The ASU Embryo Project explains that by the mid-20th century, investigators could use blood typing to exclude individuals as the source of blood samples, but not identify a suspect beyond a reasonable doubt. In practical terms, that meant blood could tell detectives who probably did not leave it, but it often could not tell them exactly who did. That distinction mattered enormously in Soviet cases. It also meant the detective's job was broader and slower. Instead of waiting for a lab miracle, investigators had to build a case piece by piece. They photographed scenes, took measurements, collected fibers and hair, compared witness accounts, checked travel routes, and looked for repeated habits in how a suspect moved or chose victims. Britannica notes that even a single hair or fiber may not uniquely place a suspect at a scene, but collections of trace evidence can establish a strong connection. That is exactly how many Soviet detectives worked, not by one perfect answer, but by accumulating enough smaller answers to narrow the field. One of the clearest examples of both the strengths and limits of this older system is the case of Andrei Chikatilo. Britannica states that police understood relatively early that a serial killer was active around Rostov-na-Donu because the victims showed recurring patterns. That means Soviet detectives were capable of recognizing a series without DNA. They did it through scene comparison, victimology, and repeated characteristics. But the same source also shows the weakness of the era. In 1984, Chikatilo was detained after suspicious behavior at a train station. Police found a long knife and other suspicious items, and yet they misidentified his blood type. Because the blood group evidence seemed not to match, he was not tied to the murders, and was released after a short sentence on a different charge. He later continued killing. That case shows the two faces of old-school detective work. On one side, investigators were able to see that the crimes belonged together. On the other side, a single forensic error in a pre-DNA system carried enormous weight. Britannica notes that after Chikatilo's release, the police response became intensive and included 24-hour surveillance of bus and train stations in one district. That is exactly what crime-solving looked like without a database hit. Saturation surveillance, stakeouts, careful observation of risky public spaces, and a long attempt to narrow behavior patterns until the suspect could be identified. It was labor-intensive, slow, and dependent on human concentration. Another revealing case is Sergei Golovkin, often called Fisher, and the police operation known as Operation Boa. A long retrospective in Petrovka, 38, the newspaper of Moscow police, describes how detectives worked through years of fragmented evidence in the Moscow region. At first, they relied on survivor and eyewitness testimony, including a boy who described a tall man with a facial scar and a tattoo. But the same article later explains that this witness account turned out to be unreliable in major ways. That is a crucial lesson from the pre-DNA era. Witness memory could open an investigation, but it could also mislead it. Detectives had to keep working even when their first version of the offender collapsed. What broke that case open was not one miracle clue, but a combination of forensic reasoning, profiling, and wide canvassing. Petrovka, 38, says investigators found hair in one burial site that did not belong to the victim, but to another murdered boy from a year earlier. That suggested the victims had been handled in one common place before burial. Detectives then drew practical conclusions. The killer probably used transport, likely worked alone, was tall, and may have had experience with anatomical work, a slaughterhouse, or something similar. They also reasoned he likely had access to a car, garage, or shed. In other words, Soviet detectives were building a behavioral and logistical profile from trace evidence and geography rather than from DNA. From there, the work became even more traditional and even more exhausting. The same source says investigators checked residential areas, industrial workplaces, health resorts, stables, and enterprises across the district, eventually collecting around 200 suitable candidates. They placed covert observation posts in areas where remains had been found. They re-examined missing boys, tracked friendships, and eventually learned from one witness that the boys had been driven by a man they knew as Uncle Sergei. That clue led them to Sergei Golovkin, an agricultural specialist who had participated in horse dissections, owned a beige car, lived an isolated life, and fit the profile the detectives had built. He was detained on October 19, 1992. That is old-school detective work in its purest form. Pattern recognition, elimination, local knowledge, patience, and field pressure. What these cases show is that Soviet detectives could be methodical, observant, and highly persistent even without modern genetics. But they also show the cost of that older world. Blood typing could exclude, but not individualize. Witnesses could guide, but also mislead. Trace evidence could suggest a pattern, but not always identify a person quickly. And all of this took place inside a Soviet system where ideology sometimes made matters worse. Britannica notes that in Chikatilo's case, police warnings were hampered by the official belief that serial murder was impossible in a communist society. So, detectives were not only fighting the limits of science. At times, they were also fighting the limits of the system around them. That is the deeper meaning of this topic. Solving crimes without modern DNA was not simply a matter of good instincts. It was a matter of disciplined observation, careful collection of physical evidence, countless interviews, geographic reasoning, and long operational work. The strengths of the old system were patience and persistence. Its weaknesses were uncertainty and the danger of false confidence. A misread blood type, a mistaken witness, or an ideologically distorted assumption could send an investigation in the wrong direction for years. And maybe that is why these old cases still matter today. Modern audiences sometimes imagine earlier detectives as either brilliant geniuses or helpless officials working in the dark. The truth was more complicated. Soviet detectives often worked with real skill, but inside a world where science was less precise, time was slower, and mistakes were harder to correct. They solved cases through legwork, not shortcuts. But they also lived with the reality that one error could keep a killer free, while one patient insight could finally bring a whole hidden pattern into focus. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.